What's up, data transformers? This is Bolaji, and welcome to Data Career Transformations, the show where we watch analytics engineers, data analysts, and data scientists transform their career. Today, I got a treat for y'all. We're talking to a data leader who's focused on building the next generation of intelligence platforms for AdTech, from electrical engineering and a modest campus guide at Yale to FinTech at Rally, a business that allows fractional ownership of collectible assets. Somehow they got their hands on an early copy of the Declaration of Independence. What? Don't even ask me how and whether or not that was under the table or not. Bruh. We gotta dig into that story. But this dude then transitioned into roles that allowed him to build out DBT instances, pricing frameworks, external data products. This is the good stuff. From FinTech to AdTech, this data leader is doing it. But here's what you don't know about him. Played jazz trumpet in high school? Yup. Tour guide in college? Light work. Former rugby player? How do you get all this stuff in one person? Data's Dizzy Gillespie, the Billy Joel of BI, representing Strong Island. Please help me welcome the Senior Director of Analytics at Kargo, Bryan Herbert. What up, Bryan?
Damn, son, where'd you find this?
This morning, I'd say that by far is the most electric introduction I've ever had. So I'm gonna use the Billy Joel of BI going forward.
Let's go! Let's go! Billy Joel. Yo, I grew up, so as a kid in Nigeria, Uptown Girl was my jam, bro. Tell me about it. What's the tie between you and Billy Joel?
I'm originally from Long Island, and when you grow up on Long Island, Billy Joel is the patron saint of the region. So you grow up listening to his music. And he's got great tunes, great melodies, but I think if you live on Long Island, the themes that he talks about directly relate to your life. And so that was the soundtrack. Being able to have his music be the soundtrack to my life. I used to go to all of his concerts at MSG once a year. We went to the last one at Madison Square Garden, which I paid a lot for, and then he ended the show by saying, "Don't worry, I'll be back." So we might have to get some sort of a refund on that, but he's been a big influence on my life, to be sure.
The legend. I love that you actually have you've had a lot of musical influences on your life. This jazz trumpet playing in high school, how does a young kid get into that? Looks like hard work. The jazz trumpet. Why?
Yeah, well, I think to start, you get randomly assigned to an instrument in fourth grade. So it's one of those moments in life where the universe guides you to something. And then I had a little bit of a knack for it, and so just kept playing. And then in high school, you get to experience a little more interesting musical styles, right? You go from classical, you learn the basics, and then you get into jazz. And that was a great experience of you have sports where you're building a team, but the intent is to battle another team that has that vein of you want to dominate the other person and win.
Win-lose. Yes.
Exactly. And with a band or an orchestra, it's a very different feel where you still have that teamwork element, but it's all about building that connection, that harmony to produce a beautiful sound. So I thought having both that athletic experience and that musical experience gave me a really good picture of team formation and what it looks like to be in a successful group, whether that's playing some Dizzy Gillespie or smashing some heads on the rugby pitch.
So, Bryan, you talked me through a framework of how you related your jazz trumpet playing, or more broadly, a band, to the function of data within a company. How would you tie one to the other?
Yeah, in building a great team, you want to get together a different collection of personalities because you can't have a team of all really extroverted, strategic-minded thinkers, and you can't have a team of all people who like to just get down to the details. You need a blend of both. And so when I was thinking about how to structure my own team at Rally and then now at Kargo, a lot of parallels came to light of it's like building a jazz band. When you look at the different roles in data of data engineer, analytics engineer, data analyst, data scientist.
Yep.
And the easy metaphor here, right, is that data engineers are like the percussion in the rhythm section. They're building the bass, they're keeping the band in control, and they're people who are they're really reliable. Their goal is to keep you on pace, keep the tempo, and make sure that the band has a structure. Yeah. And then the analytics engineers, the data analysts, they're maybe the string section, right? So that's a very powerful instrument, but it really focuses on building the additional structure on top of the bass, or the melodies and the harmonies. And I think if you think of like a traditional data analyst, right, that's what they're doing. They're taking the data that the data engineers bring in
Yes.
and then starting to add value to it, starting to build downstream tables, building BI, data visualization reports. And then you start to see the full picture. You get that full sound. And then the data scientists, as I was prepping for this, I realized they're kind of like that lead saxophone player, the smooth guy, Charlie Parker, getting ready to
This
play a
guy
great
over here.
solo. And they're doing like improv, right? They don't have a business
Oh,
problem.
wow.
They're experimenting with different models, but they don't know if it's going to work. So it's sort of like the improv portion of any piece where they are experimenting with different structures and different chords. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it does, that's what gets on the recording and goes out into production and into the world. So I
Oh,
found that to be
man.
a very helpful framework, with the noted exception that as a trumpet player, there are really no brass players in data, because I think usually you look for people with low ego and high empathy, and the brass section tends to be quite loud and extroverted. So there's a time and a place, but I found in recruiting for data roles, that's usually not the most common archetype that you see.
That is hilarious. That is hilarious. And goodness, if data is universal, music is also universal. Everybody has a musical genre that they can reference. I often, Brian, would people would laugh at me for listening to music and picking out the most esoteric sounds or rhythms like way in the back. And who knows, that might have been maybe I was a data engineer and didn't even know it. But it's like the wind instruments, maybe sometimes the vocals are the most easily recognized. They get all the credit. But if you take out the
Exactly.
percussions, if you take out, I mean, you need that foundation. Otherwise, this whole skyscraper you're building crumbles.
Exactly. I think that's a great way of putting it.
That's wild. I love how you've painted that picture. But Brian, you have taken a path that I haven't seen that often. Coming out of school, you started out in FinTech at Rally. First of all, fractional ownership of collectible assets sounds like a very fun type of company to work at. The Declaration of Independence, you're not going to get off the hook, Brian. What is going on? How in the world did you get your hands on a copy?
Yeah. So the story of Rally dates back to the late 2010s when the founders, Chris, Rob, and Max, they wanted to invest in cars or maybe some real estate. And they realized that like real estate is more of a mature asset class where there's known ways to invest in it. You can buy a house, you can invest in a REIT. And they realized they were all car guys, but there was no similar way to invest in cars, where they knew like, okay, you could buy a car. They knew which ones from the vintage class would probably go up in value, but they thought, okay, why don't asset classes like cars, collectibles, why can't they be sort of invested and managed in a similar way to a bunch of other asset classes like equities and fixed income? And they thought of this kind of really cool idea right when Ethereum and Bitcoin were having one of their run-ups and the fractionalization era was in full swing. They decided to build a platform called Rally where you could actually invest in fractional pieces of these assets. And it wasn't blockchain, it was asset backed by and SEC regulated. So that was a cool differentiating factor. And I came there in about 2019 when they first started to differentiate away from cars and into other asset classes. And so over the years, we invested in sports cards, rare books. There was a couple of dinosaur fossils on there, which we can also get into that. But my personal favorite was the Declaration of Independence, which there is not the one that is in the National Archives. But my first job at Rally was in operations capacity, managing the asset acquisition. So I was trying to figure out, what do we buy? Where can we buy it? Because a lot of these things live in a vault somewhere and people don't know about them. And then also, how do you value it? Which is that valuation question is when I first encountered DBT. But the Declaration was a really cool one where we found a copy, which I can't say where we found it, but it was from a wealthy individual who was looking to sell it. And
Gosh.
it's an early printing, so it's not, again, not the one in the National Archives, but basically the night that they declared independence, somebody went out to a local printer and said, okay, print me a couple of copies of these to spread around town and send to all the other colonies to let them know, hey, we've declared independence. Those are the ones that are like worth 20 million. So we have a copy that in one of those towns in New Hampshire, they looked at that and said, okay, this is pretty good stuff. And they made a couple of more copies and hung them around in the town square. So our copy was at one point hanging at Town Hall in 1776 in July, letting the early colonists know. And so we purchased it. We figured out how to value it, looking at other copies of the Declaration of Independence and other rare documents. And then we did like an IPO on the platform where retail investors could come in and purchase a share of a copy of one of the nation's founding documents. And that was one that probably took 6 to 9 months to get done, but I thought was a really cool blend of history and then being able to use data, some negotiation there on price, but to get a great deal done.
I'm done. That was not the Declaration of Independence.
Offline, I'll tell you about how we tried to underwrite a dinosaur dig, which was also very interesting. But we could be here for hours just on the
This
assets.
is like some Jason Bourne, Da Vinci Code, Jurassic Park type, and we hadn't even gotten to the meat of the story yet. This is wild. Here's the thing that strikes me. I mean, this is completely sensational to most of us, but I'm intrigued as to the role of data at a business like Rally. I mean, each of these assets seem so unique. How did data and DBT actually serve the company?
Definitely. I think with all these other asset classes like equities, you have these known valuation models like DCF
Right.
that have an approach to, okay, how do we value this thing? And for a lot of these assets, there's no productive value where you're not growing crops, you're not renting out houses to people. So their value is really intrinsic into how people perceive them themselves. So like we had things where like, here's Michael Jordan's sock from 1987 that I picked up off the floor in Chicago. It's worth $1 million. And we say it definitely could be worth $1 million to you, but we have to look at what is a fair market price. And that's really never been done at scale before. And so what we realized we needed to do was, we know where prices are, but to do it at scale, you have to go around to all the different auction houses and different websites that sell these assets and do some price collecting. So we would scrape the web, bring in these into our Redshift database, and then we wanted to start building out kind of these SQL queries that could deliver you, hey, what is our current prediction of price based on a basket of assets that formed an index, and looking at relative price movements where we say, okay, if sports cards have gone up as a group by 20% last quarter, and this card declined by 10%, that could be maybe it's a bad asset, but also it could be an investment opportunity. And so we were just writing ad hoc SQL queries, and those were funneling to executive reports. But we got an ask from the CEO to build out an external trading platform that could have this not real time, but most recent price interface where you could do research. And obviously we can't be sitting there manually writing SQL queries when people log into the platform. And so that's how DBT came into the picture, where my old boss, Richard Fan, who, shout out to him, he's a brilliant data practitioner. But he had worked with DBT before and tasked me with implementing it. And we were at a place as a data organization where we were going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 10, where when I first got there, they were setting up the Redshift database. We were setting up our BI tool in Tableau and then later Looker. But we didn't really have any concept of a transformation layer. And so that's where, when we onboarded DBT, a lot of it was cleaning and bringing in that pricing data, building out the SQL and Python models that would actually build the index dynamically, so that then we had this robust data infrastructure that was delivering the most recent pricing information. And we heard from customers that was a huge value add, because it allowed them to understand for themselves and do a deep dive into research on what assets they were looking for. Because some people come in and they want to invest in cars, but then they say, oh, the Declaration of Independence. How do I even start to begin to make sense of this? And that data infrastructure that DBT provided really served as a strong foundation to build out from that 0 to that 1 to that 10 in terms of the maturity of your data stack.
Fantastic. Man, dude, that's really intriguing. So one thing that strikes me, and I'd love to get a little bit more into how you traversed into these different jobs from position to position. You started out in electrical engineering as a student, right? That was your major, but your first job was Rally. Rally wasn't actually your first position, was it? Out of college?
Yeah, there was a company called Earnest Research, and that was the data.
Got it. So you never actually had a traditional electrical engineering position, I'm surmising.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's I think the way I looked. Or sorry, after you.
No. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the electrical engineering class was quite small and filled with very, very brilliant kids taking the class. And so I think by senior year, I had done a project with my advisor on designing an ASIC, which is just basically a custom chip to try to beat the Ethereum proof of work algorithm. So basically designing a chip specifically for mining Ethereum so that you could mine it very, very quickly. And through all of that, I basically learned I really enjoy electrical engineering as a domain. I am not going to be a full-time electrical engineer after college because I just saw the level that other people were at and their passion for it. And I realized, especially with that chip design project, what we came out at the end was it works and we could build it, but it would be expensive to build. And then as soon as you built it, they would change the algorithm so that you wouldn't be able to beat it anymore. And that cued me into like, oh, I like the intersection of engineering, data, and business and like how that all connects. And so that's been the through line through all my different roles where at Earnest, they taught you a really strong foundation in SQL and they were using credit card data to predict top line revenue for consumer facing companies. At Rally, that was building a data infrastructure from 0 to 1. And now at Kargo, it's going from 100 to 1,000, where Kargo is a private AdTech company that focuses on offering exclusive supply for really premium publishers, and then also building great creative design in the advertisers that we work with. And I've been at the company for a year and a half now. And at the start, they already had a robust data infrastructure, right? Where they had a great data engineering team. They had a Looker instance where they were building out a bunch of different reports. But you saw kind of the perils of growing very quickly, where they went from 100 to 500, a bunch of acquisitions for the company, and you were starting to see that the foundation was getting a little shaky in terms of how do you build out a reliable tech stack to service 500 people who are international, kind of coming from different companies and all trying to get kind of reintegrated into the centralized cargo structure. So I think that journey of going from 0 to 1 and 10 to 100 was super interesting, and the different challenges that you faced of going from nothing to something and getting the basics and then taking something that's already established and they already have their data pipelines and figuring out, okay, what is the bigger refactor that we need to do to bring it to the next level?
Man, this is rich. This is good stuff. I'm intrigued with, Bryan, perhaps the transition between some of these positions. Rally was a really, really interesting and unique sort of position. You went from 0 to 1, took your fascination for engineering, data, and business, and you were able to actually see a data infrastructure built from scratch. But then at Kargo, you had to scale a completely different set of challenges. First of all, how did you get your foot in the door at Kargo? How did you get that job?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think at around 2023, I knew it was time to transition over from Rally because I accomplished a lot of what I'd wanted to do there, and so I started looking around for jobs. I never was vaguely familiar with how ads on your phone work, where I log into a website and there are ads, and at some point they seem personalized, or the conspiracy theory that maybe you say something about a vacuum cleaner and then you open your phone and there's the vacuum cleaner ad.
Yeah.
And so I really was not familiar with the industry, but then actually through a consulting firm that we'd worked with who had helped us set up Looker and DBT, shout out to Datatonic, they connected me to Kargo where they were looking for a director of analytics, and took the interview, and I met with Andy, who's my now boss and our VP of data. And what I found fascinating was the scale of data that these companies were working with, where when you hear about, how you need to stream data and really have low latency times, you think of finance and then building servers really close to the exchanges so they can respond with trades faster. But the complexity of the AdTech ecosystem is somewhat comparable, where when you log on to a website or you pull up a app on your phone, as soon as you start accessing that page, a bunch of calls go out to different people in the ecosystem. Millions of lines of code gets executed. There's a lot of money spent on the data infrastructure, and you have to have all of these things happen in under 200 milliseconds. So the performance recommendation or the performance requirements for this ecosystem are crazy. And I thought that was a really cool challenge where I hadn't really worked with big data before. I had worked more with like establishing a team and going into the basics.
Yes.
And how I made that transition, the prep was making sure my SQL was up to snuff, really looking at what are the best practices when you're working with terabyte or petabyte sized data sets, how to interact with those, and what tools you want to bring in. So I knew coming in that DBT was on our radar as something that they didn't have that could be a useful tool. But I think the experience they liked from my end was that startup experience, that operator where you're very used to, hey, give me a problem and I can solve it. And I think that's a great advantage of starting out your career in startups, where whether the startup ultimately succeeds or fails, you have a great education in working in less of a structure and starting to put structure around it. And so I think in the way that the team was designed at Kargo, the analytics team was more of a service desk where everyone was doing a little bit of everything. And the goal was to respond to a request as quickly as possible. And coming in, I knew I wanted to change that into a different format and have us be structured in such a way where we could be working on longer term projects that were more tied to the key results of the business. So it's been an interesting transition. AdTech is full of acronyms and different concepts. In the first 6 months, I really had no idea what was happening. And someone would say, I'm working on this. I'd say, great job, keep it up. And then now, 6 months, a year in, you're familiar with the systems. You understand what all the industry jargon is. And now I feel like I and the team are really humming. So it's been a great experience so far.
This is interesting, Jason. Brian, I'm sorry. I've heard in speaking with a number of different data professionals that often it helps to have domain knowledge. That undergirds your actual data skills and can make you more valuable to your internal stakeholders. In transitioning from Rally to Kargo, you didn't have the benefit of domain knowledge, and yet they wanted you because you brought a very unique set of skills. And I find that really interesting. That almost seems like another way to differentiate oneself and make oneself attractive as a data professional.
Definitely. And I think that's something, as we're even interviewing for new roles now, if we're hiring more senior, we try to tend to look for domain experience, because as you said, that's the difference between if you can come in with a year or two's worth of understanding the problems, you can get up and going a lot quicker. But at least from my own experience of not having a lot of ad tech background and then coming into an ad tech firm, I look for a similar mold of like, we're looking for a great person who's got a quantitative background, technical skills, but has shown that they can solve problems in whatever format that looks like. So we tend to look at a diverse range of resumes. And in terms of how we structure the team, that's what's come through. Where I mentioned before, we were more of a service desk, everyone working on everything. Type of operation, more of like a technical services. And then I realized like, hey, it's taking us a while to do each of these things because no one has a domain expertise. And so now the structure of the team is we're a centralized data team, meaning we're not, I think on one hand you have like embedded teams where within the finance team or the product team, you have data analysts and data engineers, and then more centralized. We're definitely on the more centralized end of the spectrum. But at least on the analyst side, each person is now responsible for a given domain. So that might be product and engineering, that might be commercial enablement, that might be client requests. But they're not. One nuance that I think is very important is they're not assigned to a specific team, because then that limits the set of problems that you can deal with to what does that team want me to do? Instead, it's a domain. So you're working with a set of problems for the company that you want to solve. And I think the benefit of that is that gives people the impetus to go to other teams where if they say, hey, I'm working on this thing for business operations, but I know that the product team could really help. They don't have to feel like they're crossing boundaries. They have that initiative to look across teams to solve cross-functional problems. Back to the original question, like that's a big thing that we pride ourselves on within the data team and at Kargo more broadly is education and onboarding, where the first month, 2 months is making sure your SQL's up to snuff. You're familiar with our data viz tools. You get DBT certified. That's a mandatory entry requirement as you come into the company. And then you start to, for the first 3 to 6 months, play around with some of the different parts of the company and see where are you most effective and what is of interest to you. And so some of the more senior people on my team who have been there a couple of years, they now have a firmly established area of expertise and are growing in that. And instead of growing deeper into the knowledge of, say, like ad tech product, they know that pretty well. So now they're branching out into other parts of the data ecosystem where they're getting a little bit more data engineering experience, getting a little more data science experience. How can we build a basic regression or classification model to layer in more predictive analytics to our pipelines? So they're now growing more horizontally, and that's been a really fulfilling part of my job, is watching kind of my team grow, both from like a hard skill standpoint and then really being able to be effective contributors to the company because of their domain experience. So always saying, if there's a will, there's a way. You can find your way into these companies.
That is interesting and fairly different, honestly, from what I've been hearing at other companies. I love this. There's problem specialization. There's more of an opportunity, it sounds like, for cross-pollination of ideas. It's like, this problem here seems a little similar to the problem I encountered 6 months ago with that other business group. If they were purely embedded in one business group, you would have less of that cross pollination.
Exactly.
Interesting. Bryan, you played rugby for over 10 years, and I'd love to dig into that because rugby as a sport is interesting to me. I never played it. I don't know, rugby never came over to Nigeria as a big sport. We had cricket. My dad grew up playing cricket. We had all the staples, basketball, soccer. American football never made it over either. Okay, so first of all, for the uninitiated, what are the differences between American football and rugby?
That's a great question. I wrote a paper about this in college on rugby, so I'm at least reasonably qualified to answer this. But rugby started at the rugby school in England when William Webb Ellis was playing a game of soccer, and he picked up the ball and started to run with it, and that was obviously very illegal. But that's kind of the sort of apocryphal tale of how rugby got started. And so then it got brought over to the States. And so the main differences are in American football, you can pass forward. In rugby, you can only pass backwards or to the side. So it's a lot. There's fewer, I'd say, explosive plays where you have that long Hail Mary, toss back pass. And it's a lot of, there's two positions. There's the forwards and the backs. The forwards, of which I am one, are the linebackers, the offensive linemen, where your job is to tackle and run and get tackled and then hopefully break free and have that big run to the try zone. And then the backs are more of the combination between like safeties and wide receivers. And so what's cool is it's basically football played at the pace of soccer. So it's very exhausting. And there's also no pads. So I actually found that you get more hurt in football because you do have the pads. So people do some crazier stuff. When you have no pads, there's an unspoken agreement on the field that, hey, we're all a little crazy for doing this. So let's not try to too poorly injure each other. But it's been great. I think it's an international game, as you mentioned, of where it's gone around in the world. And you get a lot of really interesting characters where we've got everyone from like firefighters and cops to accountants and executives at consulting firms on the teams, and then on the field you're all equal and working together trying to beat the other team. So it's still playing to this day, and I'm starting to get to the point where the back is not getting better after 2 days after practice. So we'll see how much longer I can carry it on for, but it's been a great blessing in life to play.
Oh, this is great. I'll tell you what, the discovery of a love of sport, like any other hobby, whether it's music or goodness, collectibles, right? But finding that thing that you love and can carry through your life as long as your body will support you is truly a wonderful thing. I think we get the term scrum from rugby?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. It's certainly the same term where a scrum in terms of an agile framework. Within rugby, a scrum is when the 8 forwards get together in this mass of human flesh locked in, and you just go head to head with the other team, and it's basically a push of war where one team is trying to push the other one back, but it's hundreds of pounds of people working in tandem. And while it looks crazy on television, there's really a refined like art and skill to it, where it's almost more of like when you're in it, it's more of a chess match where you're trying to feel where the other guy's weight is moving and trying to take advantage of that, and you're feeling what all of the people around you are doing and trying to make it tighter and stronger. So it's very interesting, but I think the underlying theme is how do you work together as a team to do something that you guys couldn't do individually. And so not sure if the term's directly from rugby, but it sounds like it is, where in Agile you have the Scrum framework. And I think that's been a really powerful tool for our data team as we've grown from a couple people to 7 people. Hopefully we'll be roughly 10 by the end of the year. But I talked a little bit about before of how we were a service desk, and I think that was a good start where we were providing value to the organization. But in terms of how do we grow and set aside time for ourselves to do something like a migration from moving our transformation logic from Looker to DBT, that's not something where another team is going to be like, hey, you should do that. But it is something that once we do it and we can reduce dashboard speeds by a significant margin, that will benefit everybody. And so that I did some reading about structuring a data team more like a software development team, because I think there's obviously a lot of tools and a lot of attention and literature on how to structure a software team. And the data teams are always like second thought, right? Where we don't necessarily have all of the infrastructure that they have, but the industry is starting to move that way. And I thought that was a really good framework for us to employ. So once I joined, we picked up again having sprint planning, doing retros, doing backlog grooming, and having two parallel paths because we will still always need to be that ad hoc service desk side because the
Okay.
CEO is going to say, I need a report 10 minutes ago, build it. And you're not going to say, okay, well, first we're going to get into the basics of Looker Explorers and how to do pivot tables and all of that jazz. You're just going to need to produce it. So
Yeah.
how we manage that is we have an on-call system where one of the analysts for that day, their responsibility is to watch all the alerts and then respond to any incoming requests. So that way, if someone says, hey, I just need an additional tile and it takes 5 minutes and it actually takes 5 minutes, then they
Yes.
can handle that. So they're not just going to come back of the queue in the ticket system.
Wow.
And then the rest of the team, when they're not on call, is working on those longer term projects or more important ad hoc tickets that we've gotten from the team. And I'll say by no means are we perfect. And I'm not sort of an agile purist. And there's I think every week in our retro we have one very major thing where like we should definitely improve this. But I think overall, if you look at where our team was last in Q1 of 2024
Yes.
versus now,
Yes.
we've been able to deliver a lot more complex projects around our data infrastructure that we are leading and we are pushing forward
Yes.
as opposed to someone saying, hey, you should do this and being more of a responsive type of team. And that's
You're
that's
right.
been a
You're right.
great benefit to us. And I think the company has been like, oh, wow, treating this team and data like an engineering team can be very valuable, especially because it's a horizontal layer of the company where everyone's using data. So if we're
Yes.
saving money, queries are faster, code is built more modularly so we can ship new data models and new data products faster. That's something
Right.
that can elevate the org significantly.
Phenomenal. Phenomenal. Man, I'm loving how it feels like you've been able to bring so much of your history, whether it's from experience playing in the band or lessons from playing rugby and being able to create constructs and modes of work where the unit is able to do things that individually people would 1 plus 1 is basically equaling 3 or 4 right now with your teams instead of just 2. That's really exciting to hear. And I'm hoping that a lot of data professionals and data leaders who are watching this right now are taking notes because I think they could gain quite a bit. I'd love it if you could talk a bit, Bryan, about this concept of a data maturity curve, though, because let's be honest, even just comparing the two companies you've been at most recently, Rally and Kargo, they were at very different phases of their data maturity. I'm not sure that the same approaches might work in one environment versus another. So, how would you define the data maturity curve? And how is it relevant to the work that you're doing?
Definitely. So this is the concept that my boss Andy. This is his bread and butter. I'm fairly positive he may have a tattoo somewhere with the data maturity curve. This is his foundational framework that he's been using at all the companies he's been at. But roughly
Okay.
speaking, I mean, if you type in data maturity curve on Google, you'll get 100 different examples. So this is one opinionated view, but roughly speaking, there's 4 levels where
Okay.
at the baseline, you want to be descriptive. So you want to be able to say what has happened historically, build the data models that get you that. Obviously, make sure that those are structured correctly, that the jobs are running, that you have alerting set up for when things go wrong, either from an ingestion or a transformation standpoint, or from a business logic standpoint, and also being able to differentiate between the two. But essentially, descriptive is what's happened. Then the second layer is predictive, which is kind of what will happen, right? So the most simple example of this is a time series where if you're trying to forecast revenue and you've got the last 5 years of revenue, how do you build a model? And this is where a lot of like data science techniques can come into play of saying, hey, what's going to happen into the future? Then the layer above that is prescriptive analytics, which is how do we optimize, right? You've a lot of companies focus on getting their customers the data, and this is something that we've started to get better on. Where one example is like a campaign manager at Kargo might be thinking about,
Yes.
we can target all of these different segments, males 20 to 50, rugby players, trumpet players, whatever it may be. Which one
Right.
should I choose? And you can get them a big table of data so that they can play around with it and manipulate it in Excel and see it in different visualizations. But the onus of getting the insight is on them. So prescriptive analytics is to say, okay, now that we have the data, what is the actual framework that or stakeholders are using to arrive at their answer? And this is where, to your point, domain expertise comes into play, where really understanding the problems of your stakeholder as deeply, if not better than that stakeholder, that's the
Yeah.
foundational skill of the job. And so then being able to have optimization recommendations where, hey, we've looked at the 10,000 different segments we have, and based on the parameters of what you're looking for, this is the one you should choose, right? Because that's
Got
really the
it.
secret sauce. And then from there, you take those optimizations and then you create automations, which is the fourth level, where instead of the campaign manager going in and saying, okay, this is the segment I'm going to choose based on the data and the recommendations, the system just does it automatically. It says, okay, we found performance is going down. We need to switch out a segment, automatically swap that segment in and be able to integrate the
Sheesh.
data into the backend. We're not there yet. I would say we're at sort of descriptive and predictive, and we're making leaps and gains into prescriptive. Which one cool example that we've been working on is that all the time the client services managers, which are the people who work with the advertisers that partner with Kargo, they want to understand when there are opportunities to upsell a client, right? And that could be a certain ad format that we sell in the last couple of weeks has been performing really well in terms of how often people are clicking on it, how long people are viewing on it. But there's all these performance metrics that you can look at.
Yes.
It could be trends in the industry. It could be needs of the client. So there's all this context that a client services manager needs to put together to make this decision on, hey, do I give this client a call and say, I think there's an opportunity to drive more performance here. But that takes a long time. And you also don't know if you do all of that work, will there be a positive outcome? And so in terms of the prescriptive layer, one of the things that we did was one of the great senior analysts on my team, Kelly, put together what we call incremental triggers, where basically every week using DBT and Looker on the back end, each client services manager gets a personalized email connected to a dashboard that says, hey, here are some opportunities for incremental, where we talked with those client services managers for a month or two about, give me some examples of when this worked, right? What were the variables that were a certain value that you said, okay, now's the time to put this offer out. We codified that. We added that logic into our transformation layer. And then now you're just getting, hey, these are the 3 people that you might want to talk to. And so that's enabled, you save a lot of time where it's not giving you the full pitch, but you've got the base of the data that you need to go then take action in the real world. And we've gotten very positive feedback from that. And I think we're trying to move a lot of our insights up that curve of being able to say, hey, we've done the analysis based on the insights that you guys have given us. Here's what you do next, or here's where you should be putting your attention from a sales perspective.
The future is here, people. The future is here.
Coming. Slowly but surely.
This is fun. I want to ask you what your views are on maybe the future of business intelligence. It almost sounds like some of what you guys are doing now is maybe 5 years out for the rest of us, but in your mind, what's the future of BI? I like to think of, for reference, I love the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise. It came out, I don't know, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but it had the whole visual display of Tom using these gloves to move these screens around. I was like, that's the future of visualization. Yeah, but that was a decade and a half ago. Now we're sitting in 2025. Looking forward, what comes to mind when you think of the future of business intelligence?
Yeah, so I think in general, the industry and probably tech as a whole is at a crossroads, right? And so Gen AI is the theme that everyone's talking about. Yes. I'm probably a little more conservative in where I think the applications have to go, because I think some have the view where it's like if we get Gen AI that is as just as versatile as a human, and we get AGI, you can actually like do anything, right? But I think that we can view Gen AI as a tool in a tool belt rather than like this panacea that solves all of our problems. And so a lot of what I've been focused on with a bunch of other people at Kargo is, how do we find, instead of a hammer looking for a nail, how do we look at the problems that the company is facing, and where is Gen AI uniquely suited to meet that problem, as opposed to like if it can be done with linear regression, or if it can be done with classification or other machine learning models that are more suited to that use case, we should do it that way, because you take out the risk of hallucination. But if there's something that requires a natural language response or is a synthesis of data, then Gen AI can be pretty cool. So when it comes to BI, I think the past 10 years plus have been creation of dashboards, and there's great companies out there like Omni and Sigma trying to do new innovations along that front. But we're trying to think about, like, what does BI look like 5-10 years down the line? And this is not very insightful, but one of them might be the ability to chat with your data, right? Where you have a chat bot that's connected to your database. And a lot of people have talked about semantic search, right? Where it's connected to your company's knowledge base and all of the unstructured data, and you can ask questions of that. And we're more looking at how do you connect that same design to your structured data and make sure that it's actually delivering you the correct answer? And so one way that we're working with that is our media strategy team, which is the team that basically says, okay, we've got a new client. Here's the package that we're going to put together for them in terms of what ads types we want to run, what targeting we want to do.
Yeah.
And they oftentimes they want to collect data about a client history. And so some of their team is more or less familiar with data structure. And to use some of our tools, you have to understand what the underlying data structure is. Like, is the row level an impression or is the row level a client? And understanding those differences can allow you to interact with that data a lot better. But they mentioned one day, wouldn't it be great if we could just like talk to the data in the same way that we can talk to ChatGPT and get its knowledge base that's encoded into the LLM? And so that's what we've set about doing, where we're working with Snowflake, which is our data warehouse, to build exactly that, where we have a curated, very well managed table that has the client history of what have they bought with us before. Yes. What has been the result? And then we are using Cortex Analyst, which is a text to SQL model, where if you type in, hey, what was the performance of this ad last year? Cortex Analyst will generate the SQL from that natural language. It'll then run that against our Snowflake data warehouse, take that result, take the query, and take the original question, throw it all into an LLM. And then the output that you get is, you ask your question, here's your answer, and then here's the table that gave us that answer. And then in the logs, we're keeping track of the queries. So again, it's not fully operational yet, but we are on our way there. And I think that's what'll be most interesting to me, is how much more engagement with data do we get when it's that easy to work with it? Because I think as data practitioners, we're like, hey, you just pull in some fields and drag and drop and build your dashboard. What's so hard about that? But when you talk to other stakeholders in the company who are very intelligent people, they're saying like, I don't have the time to invest to understand at that level. And there's people who like make the investment to leverage data and others who don't have the time to do that. So how do you service that second group? And I'll be very curious to see that once we, get the MVP rolled out of this and it's productionalized, do we see a skyrocketing in the engagement of data, where they could have gotten that with SQL, they could have gotten that with our BI tool, but they're leveraging it a lot more in this new paradigm. And I think if that's the case, there's going to be that'll be a big data point for me and how we continue to build out the infrastructure.
Oh, shucks. Oh my goodness. Kargo might get flooded with resumes after this, because folks are going to want to, they're going to want to work on some of these projects.
We do have a senior analyst position open, so shameless plug there to throw on the application.
Get on it, people. Get on it. I love this framework, Bryan, that you've shared before. It answers the question of measuring business impact, something that a lot of data teams struggle with. You've almost envisioned the idea of getting on an elevator with your CEO and having to pitch on how you've advanced the business. Build this out for us. How does this help us figure out how we can communicate our value to the business?
Yeah, so I think it's a framework that's not just on every team. I think should be using it. And this is something that as a company, Kargo is moving towards, where you want to be able to measure for any project that you do the business impact. And so that's roughly speaking, how much revenue did we bring in with this project, or how much cost did we save on the top line or the bottom line?
Okay.
And to the example on the CEO in the elevator, right? When I first got to Kargo from having been in a couple jobs and seeing the people who did well, is like they always had a story that was backed up by data, but a story to tell on like what they were doing to advance the company. So if I saw our CEO Harry in the elevator and he's like, "Hey Bryan, what are you working on?" I said, "Oh, we're building a bunch of dashboards," which is true, which requires a lot of work. He's gonna be like, all right, what's the connection, right? And so we want to be able, for all of at least the big projects that we do, to be able to boil down to at least a causal framework of what are our hypotheses that if all of these things happen and the alternative hypothesis is validated, how will that in theory impact the business? So a great example is like, we have an audience team that is looking at all the different signals that we get from publishers for targeting, right? So like cookie is the main example of that, but cookies may go away. So what can we use to target instead? And so we're building exploratory dashboards for them right now to help them understand the ecosystem. That project in itself does not make us more money or save us costs, but we've worked out with them what is the logical framework of how this might generate us more money or save us costs in the future. And that might be, okay, this dashboard will help us discover new signals. If we see a big enough volume, we'll start to target on that signal. And if the performance on that targeting is high enough, that means we can drive up our CPMs, more money, more revenue, right? So we don't have exact numbers and it's a little bit art and science, but I think working with, as a data practitioner, working with your stakeholder to help them think that through as well prevents you from working on a data analyst worst nightmare where you spend 3 months building this dashboard and everyone said, we need it. And then you release it, no one uses it. And so if you can connect those dots with the person you're working with on the commercial or the product and engineering side up front, that really helps you build a strong case and then a hypothesis where at the end of the project, if you have a measurement framework, you can say, we built this and the effect that we were hoping for either did or did not happen. And then that's based on that, did that help us reach our company goal that's sitting on top of all that? So it can get a little mind numbing, but at least going through that exercise and talking through what do we expect to happen, I think really allows you to focus more on the things that are actually impactful for the business as opposed to something that one person in one corner might say, this is important, but a lot of your decisions as like a leader of a team is to figure out is the trade-offs, right? If we're working on this, we're not working on something else. And when you can try to, it's a little bit rough, but if you can at least get some estimation of what the relative value is on a dollars basis, that's at least one framework where you can start to prioritize what you're working on.
Yeah. I'm going to have to borrow that. That's really good. And you're right. That is applicable even beyond data teams. We all at some point have to justify or should be justifying our business impact. This is really good. We're coming up onto the top of the hour. I got to let Bryan get to his day job. He's obviously doing really important work. Bryan, I wonder if you could leave us with an encouraging word for data professionals who are looking to take that next step or looking to maybe build certain skills. Where would you recommend they invest in themselves, either hard skills or soft skills? What should they be doing to really prepare themselves for their next chapter in data, the data world?
Definitely. I mean, I met with a friend recently who was going through just this, where he's working in a sales role, but has a quantitative background and wants to get into data. And he was asking me the same question you're asking of how do I get in? And I think if my path is any illustration, there's a lot of ways into data, right? And into the world of engineering and products. And so I think you want to look at other people who've done it and see what did they do. But for data, what we look for is one, having the technical skills. And so I think if you didn't major in something technical, doing some of the boot camps and also being mindful of cost, where I think feedback from different boot camps, some are worth it, some not. So definitely read the reviews. But I think you have all the resources online to self-teach, obviously doing some of those personal projects. And even if you can connect those personal projects, one of the best resumes we've seen recently is someone who was working in a standard corporate job as a data analyst, didn't like it, didn't have a next job lined up, but wanted to start to prepare for that. So he quit his job, started his own little consultancy, and was solving problems for real clients. And I think that's a really powerful paradigm to follow, which it's not easy to do. But if you can work with a client and deliver value for them and show like, hey, I'm using SQL, Python, I've set up a simple database, I've set up a simple BI tool with open source software. Like if you can show that you can do the job, that's one of the most powerful ways to then actually get the job, and you'll stand out far and above the rest because you're actually, someone paid you to do this and you're not coming from sort of established company. So I think the technical skills, and then also we prioritize people with low egos and high empathy. Where your goal is to feel the pain of your stakeholder and want to resolve that pain. And if they're feeling pain because the dashboard is slow, like that's something that you should take pride in and wanting to try to resolve. And I think that, at least for my team, has served a good framework in hiring for the right people. And we've taken people who may not have been still very strong technically, but may not have been the highest, most pedigreed candidate in terms of technical skills for that personality fit, because that's ultimately what becomes, you can teach a lot of the technical stuff, but you can't teach personality and values. And so that's what we heavily bias for in our interviewing process of making sure we're bringing in the right fit from how they'll interact with the team and the larger Kargo org as a really important factor in our process.
We gotta let that moment breathe for a second, folks. He said you could teach technical skills, but you can't teach personality. Oh my goodness. Low ego, high empathy, show that you can do the job. That's the most powerful way to get the job. This one is full of high notes. It's full of mic drop moments. This has been amazing, folks. We've been talking to Bryan Herbert, Senior Director of Analytics at Kargo with a K. He's Data's Dizzy Gillespie. That's right. He's the Billy Joel of BI from Strong Island. I'm going to have to rewind this one right now and go back and listen. He's going for all-time great. I told him before the interview, like, you're trying to have an all-time great interview. You guys be the judge. How did he do? I think this was phenomenal. Bryan, thank you for coming in today.
Thanks so much, Bolaji. This was great, and I'll be changing my LinkedIn bio for those epithets that you added, because those are great.
This is amazing. We are now big fans of Bryan Herbert, and we're big fans of your entire data team. You all are building something special at Kargo. I can't wait to see what you come out with next. 2-3 years from now, I'm going to want to be chatting with my data, so I'm going to hold you to that. Bryan,
we'll see what we can do.
Yes. Whip that up for us, Bryan. This has been Data Career Transformations. Talking to Bryan Herbert. Bryan, thank you so much. People, we will see you on the next one. Bye for now. This show is brought to you by DBT. DBT is the industry standard for data transformation. It allows your team to prepare data for analysis in a way that's centralized, modular, and entirely open, all inside your cloud data platform. The outcome? Consistently dependable analytics for your organization. Now, the DBT community was built for and by data pros. Come hang out and transform with 70,000 of the brightest analytics engineers, data analysts, and data scientists in the world. With DBT, you transform your data. With the DBT community, you transform your data career.